Currently, Beam, technologically speaking, is a combination of Bitcoin because it's UTXO based, deflationary emission schedule, and Ethereum because we have smart contracts and conversion to account-based model, and Monero because everything is confidential by default. So somebody in the community even created this kind of joke that Beam is actually BEAM, Beam, Ethereum, and Monero. And this is de facto what is going on.
Hey everyone, I have the fantastic pleasure of once again speaking with the one and only Alex Romanov. How's it been?
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, it's been quite some time, and as we know, a lot is happening every day. So a few years is almost an eternity in modern terms.
Yeah, so we first spoke, I think, about 3 years ago about Beam, the Beam cryptocurrency, and kind of still when I'm kind of going back to sort of understand a few different privacy techs, specifically MimbleWimble, I do sometimes reference that interview. And so I thought I've been seeing you active on Twitter a lot more lately and seen some interesting stuff being posted. So I figured it'd be a good time to catch up. So yeah, what has Beam really been up to in these last few years? I've seen some interesting mentions of like a DEX, some stuff about smart contract functionality, and a bunch of things like that. So yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so as you probably know, Beam started back in 2018 and it was launched in early 2019 as a privacy coin based on the MimbleWimble protocol. And back in the day, it was mostly competing with Monero, Zcash, and other cryptocurrencies that were focused on private transfer of value. So I think one of the most important changes that happened in Beam over these few years is indeed the addition of Beam Virtual Machine, which supports smart contracts. Now, it's not EVM compatible, so you do need kind of to use a different technology stack to write smart contracts. However, what it allows you to do is to create smart contracts that run on top of Beam's original kind of confidential by default blockchain. And this allows you to create decentralized applications. Now, one of the important changes in the base layout Beam protocol was that we have also added support for Lilantus. So it's not just MimbleWimble now, it's also Lilantus. Lilantus is a protocol that is used primarily by Firo, formerly known as Litecoin. And what it adds is this shielded pool that you can put your UTXOs in, and then after some time, take a completely new and unlinked UTXOs out. So the reason we have added it is twofold. First of all, to improve the original kind of level of privacy of MimbleWimble and break linkability completely, so that at any point you can completely unlink all of your previous UTXOs. But also we have used the technology that we developed for the Lilantus integration. And we have completely combined the two protocols. So it's kind of this hybrid right now. We call it Lilantus MimbleWimble. We published a paper about it. It's kind of based on some research that we have done. And it allowed us to create these interesting kind of conversions from UTXO-based model to account-based model. And that in turn allowed us to add smart contracts. Now, using this technology, we have implemented a series of decentralized applications. So DEX is, like, I think, one of the most interesting examples. So basically, currently Beam, technologically speaking, is a combination of Bitcoin because it's UTXO based, deflationary emission schedule, and Ethereum because we have smart contracts and conversion to account-based model, and Monero because everything is confidential by default. So somebody in the community even created this kind of joke that Beam is actually BEAM, Beam, Ethereum, and Monero. And this is de facto what is going on. So in addition to the DEX, we also created several applications, both ourselves as Beam team and also in cooperation with other teams. For example, we have created confidential NFT gallery because it turns out, people, are interested in privacy also in the NFT world. Sometimes you want to show off a few pieces of your collection without you revealing your entire collection or your addresses. So, nobody can then kind of try to track you, outbid you at auctions and things like that. So we have implemented that. And also together with the Nefrit team, we have there is an application that's called Nifrit, which is basically a collateralized stablecoin, similar to Liquidity or MakerDAO, maybe the most familiar example.
Yeah, of course.
So there is a native stablecoin on Beam that uses collateralized debt positions. So yeah, so we have kind of quite a few applications in the ecosystem. Another interesting example is Beam name service. So it's like equivalent of ENS. Only when somebody sends your funds to your .beam address, nobody can see who it was, how much was sent, and like nobody can see what you are doing with it later. So everything that you have on Ethereum today, only with privacy.
Yeah, it's so with the entire smart contract kind of thing, and this is where, I'm sure there's quite a lot of layers of technical complexity to this whole thing. But just to try to break it down for the barely educated, let's say, I won't say uneducated, but the barely educated is when doing all these smart contract, when doing all these transactions, is that done using the MimbleWimble layer or technology, or is it using Lantis, or is there kind of a mix of two depending on how the actual smart contract is deployed? Because it makes sense from a transactional standpoint, being able to use one and then the other. But what about from the smart contract standpoint?
So it uses MimbleWimble. Specifically, it uses what we call kernel extension. So in the MimbleWimble transaction, there are three parts. There are inputs and outputs, just like in most regular UTXO-based blockchains. And there is also an additional component, which is called the kernel. This is the terminology from the original white paper. And in its most basic form, it was just created to balance the blinding factors and do some crypto-related math. But what we have done, we have actually extended it with additional metadata. And the reason it's possible is because the kernels have two properties. First of all, they're signed by both parties. So in original interactive transactions in MimbleWimble, you need both the sender and the receiver to sign it. And also, they remain in the blockchain forever, unlike the UTXOs that can be removed following this idea of MimbleWimble to create more compact blockchains. So the kernels remain, and this allows to add more metadata. And we have used it for several features. We have used it for atomic swaps, and then we have also used it for Lelantus. And when we used it for Lelantus, we had this idea to use it also for the smart contract. So basically what happens is that when you create a transaction, there is a specific metadata added to the transaction and signed by you that indicates for the node that this transaction should be handled as a smart contract transaction. So it's processed by a smart contract, and it updates the state of the node. And this is how this works in MimbleWimble.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's so what are the challenges facing a lot of EVM type chains is scalability, in that it just pretty much every single chain at some point either needs something like sharding, like execution sharding, or ends up like the Ethereum kind of path, just being on it, creating endless layer twos, it seems like, to kind of help with the scaling. Now, MimbleWimble, from my recollection on the purely transactional side, ends up kind of saving a whole lot of data and not really kind of acting as not only a privacy improvement, but also a kind of scalability function. And is this effect also, I guess, alive in the smart contract implementation?
So it's a little bit more complicated than that. So let me break it into like three parts. So the first part is the blockchain size. So the blockchain size is obviously, like, the blockchain becomes larger the more information you add to it. And since kernels are not removed, so actually adding metadata to the blockchain a little bit hinders this original, attractiveness of MimbleWimble compact blockchain. Still, all of the cut-through properties, remain, right? So the regular UTXOs get compacted and can be removed, but the kernels that indicate more complicated and advanced transaction types obviously make the blockchain larger. Now, in terms of the scalability in the transaction per second, so this is one of the key challenges that the current layer twos, come to solve. And obviously, it's a great approach. but my personal issue with most layer twos today is their centralization. So you kind of give up decentralization, to gain speed when you are using either optimistic or zk rollups today, and it's kind of a trade-off. You cannot easily overcome this issue. Now, all of these approaches are also applicable on Beam. You can build, optimistic or zk layer 2 on Beam as well. However, in the kind of intermediary time that you do want to have some better performance from decentralized applications, but you don't necessarily want to use layer twos, what we have done, we have created this mechanism that's called high frequency transactions. So the idea is that using the original blockchain, the layer one, the mempool is being treated differently. The mempool is being treated as a tree instead of just a list of transactions that the miner chooses from. And what it allows you to do is to write applications that are aware of the current state of the mempool, and they can react to transactions that have not been mined yet, and say, okay, I want my transaction to be included after this specific transaction or not at all. Because if the miner doesn't choose your branch, then your transaction will be obviously included in the next block or completely removed. And what it allows you to do is to get better response time from the application, right? When you're trading, you don't want necessarily to wait for the block to be mined. And in Beam, it's 1 block per minute, unlike Ethereum, which is 15 seconds. Yeah. So, the interactivity factor is lower. And what you want to be able to do is to understand what is going to happen in the next block, even before the block is mined, and then say, okay, so if these are the conditions that are happening, I want my transaction to respond to them. So this improves the user experience. This improves your ability to use the dApps and trade, without necessarily kind of having this, I send transaction, and then I wait, and then I do something. Now, there is an additional interesting kind of feature that in MimbleWimble, you don't pay for failed transactions. So unlike Ethereum, where your transaction can be kind of not exactly doing what you wanted it to, but you still pay the fees, in Beam, it's either it's in the block and you pay the fees, or it's not there and you paid nothing. So it's a little bit kind of better for the user experience.
Of
so
course.
you don't encounter these situations. Yeah.
Yeah. And so obviously, it's not an EVM chain. That's one of the big things where everyone creating kind of smart contract capabilities has to weigh this thing of, well, we see all the problems Ethereum runs into because of its design, but it's, at the same time, everything is built on Ethereum these days. And so we don't want to introduce extra complexity by having people build things from scratch or not be able to port over super easily. Has that been a challenge, having having a different setup, or is it still similar enough that you could possibly make a few tweaks and otherwise it just works?
So I have good news here.
Yeah.
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So the good news is that we are actually very far in the process of adding Ethereum virtual machine to Beam as well. And what is going to happen is that in the next hard fork, which is, I hope, going to be somewhere towards the end of this year, we are going to add EVM support in addition to Beam virtual machine. So I was and still kind of, a little bit, I would say, not a fan of EVM for many different reasons. And we also see that the contracts that we implement in current Beam virtual machine in C++ are much more compact. They're much more robust in many ways. But as you said, the community of developers is there in Ethereum. And today, EVM is becoming a sort of standard de facto used in many different chains. So for the portability and for the developer community, we will add EVM support. And this will allow running existing applications on Beam with the privacy at the base layer, which is very important. So this is something that we're working on right now. It's the main focus of our next hard fork. So yeah, it's happening. I don't exactly know whether we're going to be in testnet in the next month or so, but it's somewhere around that time. And obviously we will update in our community channels. But this is happening. Now, in the meantime, what we're doing is a couple of things that I want to mention. So first of all, We are currently focused on not only using, the base layer, obviously, and DeFi layer, but we also want to be able to integrate with Web3 applications from all kinds of, not just financial ones, but also applications that deal with more kind of, I would say, live user data. Because what we have found out during our almost over 5 years of dealing with privacy is that, interestingly, people sometimes don't care enough about their financial privacy. So they buy tokens and NFTs and they trade in DeFi, do whatever they want without privacy. But when it comes to their other types of data, their job status, marital status,
Yeah, of course.
Suddenly all of these questions about privacy become much more relevant, and people are very aware. So, for example, if you are looking for a new position, obviously, you don't want immediately, like if you publish that you're looking for work, you don't want your current employer to know necessarily. You don't want others to know exactly, how much you're being offered. So suddenly all of these questions about your privacy become much more relevant. So since we have a lot of integration options, right? We have the API, we have the smart contracts now. So we can be integrated both in kind of older Web 2 ways and newer Web 3 ways. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to find partners to integrate with kind of different applications that need privacy for many different purposes. And one of the interesting things that we've done, we've created a completely decentralized app store, right? So, for example, one of the issues that a lot of people face today in Ethereum, let's say, that even though the smart contract is decentralized, the front end that you are using to access this smart contract is centralized. And this is what allows you to censor some of the information on the front end, right? So, Uniswap can delist some assets from their front end, even though they're still accessible from the backend. So in order to avoid this, what we've done is we created a completely decentralized way to package and publish applications using IPFS. So you can even do this anonymously, right? So we have a smart contract, which is a kind of decentralized app store. And it allows you a lot more flexibility of, all of the applications are accessible from your local wallet, installed on your machine. You're not dependent on any web server. And if you remember, like back in the day, we had developed this SBBS, which was kind of a messaging system between the wallets, which was encrypted, and we used it to create transactions. So we have expanded it to allow a lot more kind of interesting features that are related to communications between wallets. So today we use it, for example, to publish your asset swap. So if you want to swap two assets, right? So without going to DEX or a centralized exchange, we have this built-in marketplace that you can say, I want to swap, X number of assets A for Y number of asset B, and this swap is kind of direct peer-to-peer atomic transaction. So this in MimbleWimble, in one transaction, you can exchange any number of assets. So we've used this BBS for these things. And then somebody said, why don't you build a messenger, encrypted messenger between the wallets? So we did that, but this messenger is very primitive, I would say. It's very basic. So what we're doing right now, and actually kind of in next couple of days, we're starting a hackathon where what we're going to do is to use all of these underlying technologies, the IPFS integration, the SBBS, and obviously the blockchain and the smart contracts, to build something on the Nostr protocol. You're probably familiar. Yeah. So the Nostr is a protocol built for decentralized communication networks, such as Twitter, decentralized Twitter, etc. And it's based on the concept of relays. So anyone can create a Nostr relay. Now, unlike Mastodon, it's not like everyone has their own server. It's rather interconnected network, and the Nostr protocol specifies which features and which details need to be implemented for all of these different components to work with one another. So the purpose of the hackathon, which will last for the next 2 weeks till the end of the month, so the end of August, is to use this Nostr protocol to build interesting decentralized applications on top of Beam. It can be a messenger, but it can be something even more interesting. For example, you're probably aware that there's a huge popularity of Telegram bots right now that you use for trading
everywhere.
Exactly. So this is something that can be used on Beam, because Beam dApps, they integrate with the wallet. So you can create transactions, you can participate in interesting, financial kind of interactions. and all of that without revealing your identity, without giving up on your privacy. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see what people build with it.
Yeah, for sure. And Nostr has definitely popped up kind of in a lot of people's minds. And unfortunately, a lot of the stuff I tend to see is just very simple, like rudimentary social media, or then Bitcoin maxis trying to add lightning tipping and using it here and there, and it's fine. But nothing kind of probably needs a little bit more of a something kind of a little bit more kind of innovative, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. And you asked me at the beginning of the call about the state of privacy, like in general, right, across the industry. So unfortunately, I would say that I think it's not kind of been used enough or integrated enough for several reasons. The first reason is that as we saw many times, people don't really care about the privacy in most financial transactions, which is strange, but that's what's been happening. And also there was still, I think, that the adoption of Web3 or like decentralized applications in general did not reach the level where there's like huge awareness. However, we do see all the time all of these interesting kind of situations where people get frustrated with Web2, large, especially companies, in regards to treating their data, treating their identity, scanning their eyes, I don't know, whatever. So there is, like, I think, this kind of point where people start asking more questions about, wait a second, where does all this information go? What happens to it? Like who? And so, yeah, like it always seems like there is a place or a good place for privacy coins, privacy blockchains in general. But I think we're still very, very far from kind of mass adoption.
Yeah, we're definitely very early to this whole thing. And I kind of see back in the day, I guess, there was just a couple of projects in the crypto space focused on privacy in any kind of a way, and everything else kind of wasn't. And now I see it everywhere under the surface, right? You have, like, for example, in Bitcoin, more money is in the CoinJoin whirlpool right now than in the whole Lightning Network. And there's a lot of projects on Ethereum that are starting to add in things like privacy. Like, for example, the Railgun smart contract has, I think, generates like $200,000 a day in fees just from usage. Well, the rest of the network is completely not doing that. And so there's a lot of things cropping up, but at the same time, the average person, and even the above average person, doesn't seem to be kind of aware of the risks of this at all. It seems like privacy is still something where it's just like, well, it's good to have. People say it's good to have, but it's not like a feature that people care, that the market is caring about, en masse. Like it's kind of a niche type of a thing. And it might be that I have seen a significant turnaround since the Snowden days, where now VPNs are very common and they're advertised a lot. And then a lot of people I know who aren't crazy libertarians or crazy crypto people are on Signal or other encrypted messages. And then Apple's entire marketing strategy right now seems to revolve around privacy. So it's coming up, but it still hasn't hit the average user yet that this is something you absolutely need. It's a crucial feature.
Yeah, so I totally agree. So first of all, we did see quite a lot of progress, as you said. The end-to-end encryption is becoming a standard. Many additional technologies, but there are two interesting points that I have noticed. First of all, people do not really distinguish between what I call little guy privacy, like Monero, privacy for each and every one of us equally, and big guy privacy. For example, ZK rollups, right? So they are providing privacy, but they're providing privacy for people outside this kind of system that creates those rollups, and then the government or somebody can access the source of where these ZK proofs are created, and then ask questions there. So they do provide privacy, but it's not like privacy for just everyone equally. So this is one very important kind of distinction that everyone needs to be aware of, because when I hear like, oh, but yeah, but ZK rollups, they provide privacy. So yeah, but you just need to be aware for whom and
Yeah,
how
of
much.
course.
So the second point was very interesting. Recently, you probably heard about this Arkham Intelligence story that blew up, that they kind of advertise the marketplace to docs accounts on chain, and there was a lot of discussion about it. And there were several Twitter spaces that I listened to, including very influential influencers with lots of followers. And I noticed this very strange kind of I would say attitude. Like, people are a little bit ashamed that they want privacy. They're a little bit kind of oh no, I don't really need privacy myself, but if I things like that. And it was very kind of strange for me, because I would say, like, yeah, but like, what do you have to lose, right? I mean, all of these kind of arguments, like, oh, what do you have to hide, or what are you doing that you don't want anyone to know? These arguments, they're very basic and not very interesting, but there is this kind of sentiment that privacy is always associated with something bad. And it's funny because, I mean, like, one of these participants on that specific space, he said, bank account is private. It's not. It's private
Yeah.
because only few people that are signed on some contracts know about your account, but they do know, right? So it's private for maybe somebody from the outside walking into a bank and asking how much money this guy has, but it's not, it's not like it's completely private. So it's
Yeah, of
all based
course.
on these social constructs, right? And every time the word privacy comes up in many discussions, there is always like, oh, what about money laundering? Like, yes, it's a problem, but come on, like, we do need privacy in many, many different things, regardless. So this is something that only kind of, I would say, education, what we are doing here, trying to kind of show people that, first of all, they do use privacy every day in many different areas, even if they're not aware of this. And also, privacy is not a bad thing in and of itself. So yeah, I think it's important, the awareness, the understanding of what it means. In general, like, some people think that if you create a new address, you're suddenly becoming private and nobody knows about it, which is completely not true in the age of chainalysis and any other, like, analysis tools. So yeah, we did go so far, but the road is
Yeah.
still
We
ahead of
still
us.
definitely need a lot of improvements there. But one thing I think is interesting, which kind of loops back to the financial privacy aspect, is that a lot of people, I think that when people mention that it's very easy for people to say that they don't value privacy because, as they say, talk is cheap, transaction fees are zero, right? But people speak a lot with their money. That's where truth is. People don't. There, I don't think there's such a thing as lying money. You can't lie with money. You value something and you give the value, and so there's a lot of money in privacy. It's starting to grow. Maybe it's not nearly as big as it needs to be, but for example, I've been recently doing a lot of getting deep into the whole like de-googling of devices and like the more extreme privacy things, and it's very interesting to see just how many companies are able to make, sustain at least one employee, I should imagine, based on offering these very strange services like one-off phone numbers for SMS verification, and most of those accept cryptocurrency, which is pretty interesting. And then how many VPN providers there are, and then just how many VoIP providers, and how many. Then there's privacy.com, which gives you different credit cards all the time. They're like single use almost, just so you don't have your transactions traced, which is a very strange. It's kind of like a fiat tumbler, more or less, a fiat kind of
Yeah.
thing. And then there's a lot of all these companies have employees and make a lot of money, and it's started to come, and you can't. I think that in the utter, I guess, irony or funniness of it, I think that the public discourse will be the last to reflect how important privacy is for society. I think that it'll be private. It'll be through people's private decisions that they show that privacy is very important.
Yeah, I mean, all of these services that you mentioned, I think they definitely exist. They definitely make money, and they're definitely growing. And the reason they're growing is because I think mostly of these kind of evolutionary processes that people, the more they grow up within the technology that we currently use, the more aware they are of what all of this means for their daily lives. So the more they're likely to understand these things better, which is great, and that's what we need to do. I think that let's say internet hygiene, so to speak, is something that should be taught at schools because I look at my daughter and she's 16 and she uses all of these applications, and she has, like, let's say outside of my preaching, very little awareness of meaning, of things, of storing passwords, of sharing data, and so on. That's definitely true. But I think, like, and it's a little bit kind of a different take on this, I would say, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. I think the whole model of Web3 and how it's going to be replacing Web2 in many different areas. So, for example, many companies today rely on advertising and the value they get from advertising, and a lot of data that is collected is for this purpose, right? So they can know you better, and then they can advertise to you in a more targeted way and make more money. So this was one of the major kind of I would say clashes between these titans of in the industry, the Apple and Facebook, right? About, like, Apple has the platform, Facebook does not. So that's why they try to build this metaverse where you will be in their virtual world and sharing data with them instead of going through Apple first. All of these interesting ideas. But Web3 gives us very interesting new options of compensating. Let's say let's talk even about creator economy, right? So when you are watching somebody's YouTube channel for lengthy period of time, even if you give like, I don't know, a few dollars on Patreon or any other kind of sponsorship platform, it will probably be better for the creator than you watching hours of ads on their channel, right? Now, the blockchain world makes it very easy and very fast doing this, right? So you can just click, and all of us, when we have experienced the immediacy and the quickness of sending money on blockchain, it's very difficult to go back to the old banking system after that, right?
Yeah, of course.
So when you pay someone, on Ethereum, it's like one click and they have the money directly in their wallet. There is no Swift, there is no forms, there is no calls, nothing is and everything works. So I think that if, and this is like kind of one of the directions that I really want to pursue, both, as Beam project, but also in general as the industry, if making these payments to creators faster and more immediate, using stable coins, using assets on the blockchain, because I think when you're watching somebody's video and you now need to go to the Patreon page and log in and enter your credit card and do all of these things, it deters a lot of people from doing that, even though they would really like to send $1 to this guy because he's a great content creator and they really enjoyed their stream or podcast or video. So I think slowly this advertising-based economy will change to kind of more like different Web3 native ways of compensating creators. And then a lot of this data will also become less relevant to these companies. And this is also be one of the factors, well, people will need to share less. Because today that's kind of one of the reasons that everyone wants all of your data, because they never know where they can use it in targeting.
Yeah, that is a very interesting dynamic shift because I've kind of seen it's the old model of the internet was provide everything for free, but then farm your data for profit, and that's been kind of the whole model. And a lot of times, so as a person who like agrees with the free market, I have no problem paying for services that provide me value. The problem is the non-money part of the payment is the worst with like the fiat world. And so, for example, I was using Midjourney not too long ago for doing some AI graphics and stuff, and then I tried it out once with some like prepaid card for privacy, obviously, and it worked. And then the next month it just like didn't, and it just won't. And so now I'm just not using Midjourney. I'm using a different tool that's free, because not that I had clearly didn't have a problem paying, but I did have a problem with just the friction of like having to sign up and all this. And when I'm trying a new tool, they say, well, sign up for, like, I'm not going to sign up. I will scan a QR code and pay you a few little bits of cryptocurrency for a single use thing, but I won't go through this drama and enter the password manager and all this stuff. It's just, I'm not going to do any of that. And I think that as we find easier ways for people to just connect and pay without the whole KYC process, without all this info, without signing in and logging in, with just like a one-click sign a MetaMask type transaction. Of course, hopefully something better than MetaMask for, lots of reasons. But I think that'll make it easier for people to do direct payments and direct tipping and things like that. But also, if you let the information, the burden of information collection falls on the creator at that point, because if I'm a creator and I make my money from individuals who like my content, I have to do market research. I have to figure out what content I could produce that they like, what they will pay for, and I have to collect data in some way. And it's not broad Orwellian surveillance data. Sometimes it's just my channel statistics. And whereas if an advertiser needs to know all this kind of data just to provide effective ads, if they don't have the advertising, then at that point, the platform creator can just take a small fee off of whatever the creator receives. They don't have to care. They outsource the data collection to the specific creators. And then even if the creators are working directly with advertisers, then it's also still outsourced. So it's not like there's not like no data collection, but it's not this giant everyone's data, this data industry. It's much more kind of localized to specific channels and things like that.
Yeah. So first of all, like thinking about it, all of this login with user email, it's so like ancient. Yeah. And this is exactly the point, because first of all, when you are communicating directly with the creator, you don't need this cross-site tracking, right? It's like when we are in this kind of scenario where I'm watching a channel of some creator and I want to donate, or the creator wants to engage me directly, the creator doesn't need to know whether I was on other websites or other services and try to kind of cross-reference that data. So yes, it gives you much more kind of direct and immediate way of communicating, which in my opinion is obviously better. But also, when you're talking about like these, how would they put it, like tracking, like I think most of this data is not even really used. It's being collected and it's being stored somewhere. Now, you would say like, okay, so what's the problem, right? If it's not used, the problem is that it leaks. It leaks in many different ways. So, you actually need to know my age, but what you collect is my entire, resume of everything. And then you only use my age, but you still have all this data and it's stored somewhere on the server. So somehow it gets into, I get like 10 phone calls a day from various organizations trying to sell me something. Obviously, I never registered for anything with my phone, right? So they got it from the voter database or any other government organization, but that's how it works, right? So that's the problem. But one thing that I do say about Web3 is that you will kind of pay for more things. You will directly pay for more services that you are using. And yeah, so this kind of, I pay for this, it will be much more ubiquitous because now you get a lot of services for free, but they harvest your data, and it's a good thing. Because think about it, when now we have like music streaming services, right, which are affordable, which are relatively well
Yeah.
built, you don't need piracy anymore. You don't need, buying CDs anymore. You gladly pay, their charge, and you listen to a lot of music when you travel and when you're working. So it works, right? You pay for the service and you get it. So I think that's slowly what's going to happen with most, like, email and, search, whatever. All of these things will move to this one. So that's uh, what I think the future of Web3 will bring us.
Yeah, and obviously, I think that a lot of former revenue models have kind of gone around. They haven't come from a very direct consumer to business relationship of, I want this, well, I want you to pay me this, and then find something that's agreeable, and just both sides are happy. There seemed to be this like trying to trick people into things like, well, let's give you a lot of things for free, but then the exact thing you want is not free, and then you have to sign up, and then once you sign up, you're paying, and we part of the model is on people who pay for things they don't use anymore. And so instead of using things for free and then paying for things you don't use, just only pay for what you use, I think could be
Yeah,
a better
yeah.
model.
So it's a combination of freemium with this concept of gyms. When you register to a gym, but they actually hope you will not come, because if everybody do come, then there will be too many people. So it's kind of a overbooking style.
Yeah, of
So yeah,
course.
that's how many platforms monetize these days, for sure. And when so yeah, like when you're paying, so the problem is that it separates, like it gives a different role to the platforms, because the platforms have become too powerful. Like when it started 15 years ago, uh, that was not the case, and then gradually, when all of the content is now on YouTube and on Facebook and on Twitter, suddenly you feel this balance shift, right? Between, okay, wait a second. So it's no longer like I am a creator on the platform. The platform can actually ruin my life accidentally, or, intentionally, whatever. Like they can shut my channel, they can remove my streams, they can remove my content, and then I will be, if I depend on this income, I will have a problem, and that's an issue. I recently watched a very interesting video about this whole kind of decline of the gig economy, right? And the idea is that we invest and we subsidize a lot of activities in order to gain traction and, bring millions of users, and then it will pay for itself.
Of course.
So it doesn't work, and it's also a problem today when the money is much more expensive. It's much more difficult to raise all of these additional hundreds of millions to support that, and then you see suddenly all of the services that were initially cheap, whether it's delivery or any Uber or any other, suddenly become much more expensive, because when you don't have the massive amounts of investor money to subsidize it, and you get back to your real profit
model.
versus, yeah, exactly. Then suddenly it's like, whoa, wait a second, that used to be cheap, now it's not. Like, what happened? And what happens is that somebody stops subsidizing.
Yeah.
So I think we're going there anyway. Yeah.
Well, we're definitely going that way with blockchains as well, where like Ethereum generates revenue, Bitcoin generates about 10%, but still generates some revenue. Everything else does not generate revenue for the most part. There's a few things, like I mentioned, Railgun, the smart contract generates things. Obviously, there's multiple Bitcoin CoinJoin based businesses that have remained operational for years, so they must make something. There's all kinds of things like that people will pay for, but at some point, the inflation runs out of every cryptocurrency, or runs low, and then you have a problem to deal with. And even Bitcoin has to deal with that problem because of, I guess, constrained throughput and people just not wanting to pay more than a certain amount per transaction and all that kind of stuff. But so no, I wanted to briefly touch only on the Binance thing, only because it's a little bit old news, but also, it just as an aside. So Binance delisted a few different cryptocurrencies that were associated with privacy, and then they reversed the decision and relisted at least Zcash, if not, I don't remember which other ones were. But then they kept Beam, Furo, and a few other ones off. It's probably, shouldn't be read into too much necessarily. Do you think that there was legit reasons for picking exactly which projects they decided to do that with, or was it a very simple thing like Zcash had a line to them and just called them up and said, "Hey, this is nonsense," and then they just said, "Oh, never
Uh,
mind." What do you think personally? We don't know, but what do you think?
yeah, so there are several kind of things combined here. So the first one
Mm-hmm.
is that specifically the listing of Beam, it happened before all the other kind of the story of delisting all the other coins. And I think it was mostly for financial reasons and not necessarily kind of
Like
specific
trading
attack on
volume.
yeah, trading volume. And it was a big surprise for us because exactly at the same time we were having discussion with a different Binance team about our hardware wallet integration that they needed, and we just updated them that we are almost completed with that. And then like the morning after, we saw on Twitter that we've been delisted, right? So it was very kind of, I would
Terrible way to
say,
find
not
out, huh?
yeah, it wasn't communicated at all to the team. I mean, it has also the good things, like we didn't have to explain that we knew in advance or whatever, because we didn't. We found out with, together with everyone else, which is great. But then what happened? It was funny because when all of these additional coins were delisted in Europe, Beam was mentioned again, even though we were already delisted for a while at that point, right? So it
Hmm.
was kind of free publicity of sorts. And then, in even funnier decision, they have released some of them back. Now, let's talk about this part. So,
Hmm.
first of all, there are these projects that use the word privacy in some contexts, but they were not kind of in of itself like privacy coins. Like, for example, Secret Network. Secret
Hmm.
Network is a project that is running confidential smart contracts on a Cosmos ecosystem. So the
Hmm.
blockchain itself is not confidential, but the code that is executed in smart contracts is, because it uses Intel SGX, secure execution environment, right?
Hmm.
So they are called Secret Network. They use the word privacy in their marketing materials, but they are not per se equivalent to Monero or Beam or Fuel. Okay, so that's the first type of projects. The second type of projects is projects that are not confidential by default. So Zcash, for example, most of their transaction volume comes from non-private transactions. And if the exchange, for example, handles only non-private addresses and does not use shielded addresses, it can be made, I think, compliant. And also, Chainalysis does analyze the non-private part of Zcash, right?
Hmm.
So once again, most of these delistings came as a reaction to the MiCA regulation in Europe.
Hmm.
So that was exactly the point of like, wait a second, what does it mean, right? Which information do I need to collect and provide to the authorities to list the coin, to list the project? And they have decided that yes, it was profitable for them because they had enough volume to cover the costs, and they didn't run into too many issues with MiCA or like regulators about monitoring Zcash. So I think for these specific kind of types of privacy projects with partially shielded transactions, that was the kind of the thinking process that they made, like how we can monitor it to provide enough information to the regulator without giving up on the volume of the entire coin. So yeah, and obviously those projects that were confidential by default and relatively small, like Firo, like Beam, like they obviously were removed because why take the risk if you don't get enough profit out of it.
Yeah, it's it's kind of interesting. It seems like the by default thing seems to be a big sticking point. And so like I've done a lot of work in the past with the Dash community, and
Mhm.
uh, from a technical standpoint, I mean, a coin join on chain, even though there's some actual network level involvement, it's not different from what you could do on something like Bitcoin, which never gets delisted over privacy concerns in the crypto space, of course. And so it's been very, in that case, it's very hit or miss. It's like sometimes you avoid a delisting, sometimes you don't because they just heard about Darkcoin in 2014 and just don't care enough. But then it seems like something like Monero has never managed to stay out of that. And a lot of that's because of reputation. And they've worked very hard to make sure that they have a reputation as something that criminals use, which is, it's great marketing and it's also not great marketing at the same time. Just pick your poison, right?
Hmm.
But it seems like the inability to do something transparent easily, you know, seems to be a sticking point. Whereas I know with like you can use view keys and things like that with Monero, but my understanding is it's the user experience of being transparent is not very good at all.
Yeah. So um, first of all, indeed, like I think like the confidentiality by default is one of the major differentiating factors between privacy projects
Mm-hmm.
for a good reason. And I think there are two things that kind of first thing that happened. I don't remember if it was this year or last year. The Tornado Cache
Mm-hmm.
being added to the kind of
The sanction list.
list. Yeah, so that like was the first time in history that a smart contract, which is automated, was added to this list, and the one of the developers was jailed for like probably even till
Yeah.
now. And
Yeah, I
so
was in Amsterdam a couple months ago at his first public appearance after getting out, and yeah, poor guy. I mean, it was really bad for him.
exactly, right. So that was a shock to like, whoa, wait a second. Like it changed a lot of perception. It raised a lot of awareness because after all, when you're talking about exchanges, especially big exchanges, they don't really want to be in the situation where they need to, deal with this or explain this or pay lawyers to understand what's happening. Right. So this is the first point. But the second point, which is in my opinion much more important, is that it's not a such big a problem of combining privacy and
Hmm.
regulation. Even Mika. And we have
Yeah.
been talking about that from day one, from like our like earliest days in 2018, 2019, of how to do this. And back in the day, we did a lot of consulting with, I think it was Deloitte, like one of these big
Hmm.
companies that specialize in regulation, to try to understand what would be the necessary requirements and features that we will need to kind of create what we call opt-in auditability, right? So if you want to be compliant as a user, what you can do. And the answer is that the biggest kind of unresolved issue today is the source of
Mm.
funds in a global sense, right? Like, okay, you can always explain what you did, but you cannot necessarily in privacy by default world explain what the person that you got the money from did. Now
Hmm.
that is also solvable. It's solvable with smart contracts. It's solvable with all kinds of interesting policies added. It can be done. By the way, one of the things that the recent development of the account abstraction wallets is promising is exactly this kind of flexibility, right? So you don't rely necessarily only on your external address. You can also do some interesting logical things in the smart contract wallet itself. So there is potential. The problem is that nobody cares and nobody is working in that direction. Like if people would say, listen, we are not giving up privacy, let's find a way to make privacy and regulation work. Technologically speaking, it's a non-issue.
Hmm. Yeah, but there's the will. It's kind of interesting to see where the will is on that because uh, a lot of people who care very much about privacy only care about compliance as much as they absolutely are forced to, and a lot of people who care about compliance really would rather there be no privacy for the everyman anyway. And so it's the in between part where you have like institutions that need privacy and are compliant, for example, or there's or when it starts to hit reality a little bit more, and
Exactly.
it's not hitting reality yet, really.
Exactly. So I think this recent development of PayPal stablecoin on Ethereum,
Mm-hmm.
I think is going to be interesting because when people will start using, real money for real things on non-private
Mm-hmm.
blockchains, they will, suddenly discover a lot of interesting surprises. Because until now, what was happening is that all of the institutions, and I'm talking about the biggest one, right, like JP Morgan Chase and all of these, they have been using only private blockchains. They have been developing
Mm-hmm.
their own systems. Some of them are forks of Ethereum with different consensus and then extending on that. But that was all in closed ecosystems, completely permission, and they never dared to do anything on private blockchains because the last thing they want is for their competitors to be monitoring their addresses all the time, right?
Yeah, of
And
course.
there was never like USDT and USDC, they were crypto native, like in a way, right? They have been born on chain. But now when PayPal uh, is kind of bringing their user base, which is the old school, old world Web2 user base, to Ethereum. This is going to be, in my opinion, interesting thing to monitor and watch, because then people will, somehow, for the first time in their lives, encounter this question of like, wait a second, who can see what I just bought? And then it will be
Yeah.
interesting to see.
Yeah, it probably will end up being not just that kind of surveillance, but the kind of I guess criminal surveillance, petty criminal surveillance. Even when people start saying like, oh, pay me from pay, and then they track the PUSD back to figure out how much money they have, and then this starts to spread over TikTok. People making TikToks about, oh, I got held at
Yeah.
gunpoint, and they knew exactly how much money I had, and so I couldn't pretend and then and
Yeah,
then it'll
something
click
like
for
that.
people.
I hope, nobody gets hurt and everything, but yes, like it's an issue. And one of the kind of, I think, aspects why, like, a lot of people have been living in a relatively, I would say, non-threatening life conditions, which is good, right? But one of the problems with privacy is that it's difficult to enforce in retrospect, right? It's difficult to say, oh, I wish I was private in 2021.
Yeah, no, that's all out
This,
there.
yeah, so that's something that people should be aware of, because one of the things that we have seen, unfortunately, for the last a year and a half or even more, like, is how quickly some things can change in something that you consider today to be completely illegal and completely fine, and then, like, it's yeah, it's an issue. It's especially an issue in countries like Russia and Belarus today. But yeah, like it's something that it's good to be aware of that, because the less they know, the better you sleep eventually.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's touch on the expansion of Mimblewimble into the top of the crypto market rankings through Litecoin. Now, this is something I kind of was watching with a little bit of a side eye for a while, which I just, because as far as I know, it was just one developer who kind of implemented this. It seems like the first, what I would call, maybe it's not the, it's in true Litecoin fashion, it's not a unique development necessarily, but it's the first non-Bitcoin development on Litecoin that I've seen in a long time, other than just changing the supply in the block interval, like in the founding. Everything else was like, well, let's do SegWit, let's do the Lightning Network, let's do ordinals, and then the BRC20 kind of token stuff. Like, let's do all that on Litecoin. But Mimblewimble was kind of added as an extension block, and is an interesting development. So, what's your whole take on that whole situation?
Yeah. So first of all, yes, it was work of one very talented developer, and he came kind of. He's been contributing for Green, which is like one of the first Mimblewimble projects. He was a
Mm-hmm.
long-time contributor. So in Litecoin, it's implemented as extension blocks. So it's kind of an
Mm-hmm.
optional additional feature. So it doesn't transform Litecoin to be confidential by default.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. Like, I don't have stats. I really didn't follow the statistics of how much it's used.
Mm-hmm.
But two things. So first of all, yes, like any improvement in privacy, especially in kind of Mimblewimble, which is our base protocol that we've used a lot, is great. Um, I still think that being confidential by default, like, if you want privacy, go use Monero, or or
Mm-hmm.
Beam, or like, it's important, right? So if you care about privacy, I think people will still prefer confidential by default protocols. Um, yeah, I think that's it. But once again, I am not really in in many details, and um, it happened quite a while ago, so there was some buzz around it. There
Mm-hmm.
was, like, obviously, everything that increases awareness and increases adoption of privacy is good. Specifically for Litecoin, how much, what is the volume of their confidential transactions, compared to the regular volume? I don't have data on that.
Yeah, as far as I know, it's only implemented in the Litecoin Core wallet, like the full
Mm.
node regular one. And I've seen a few transactions pop up on block explorers, but that's kind of about it. It's a major talking point for Litecoin these days, though. which is kind of interesting because Litecoin has larger on-chain capacity than Bitcoin, but does not have a large a plan to, I guess, scale beyond that necessarily. But it's having the ability to use these extension blocks kind of presents. It's been marketed a lot as a scaling solution, or that Litecoin doesn't have to worry as much about scaling as something like Bitcoin, because if enough traffic just hits into MimbleWimble, then it'll turn out a lot better. Have you noticed any increase in, I guess, attention on Beam around that time, or now that where you hear people who heard about it from Litecoin and then are like, oh, I'm going to look into other MimbleWimble projects?
Yes, there was, but it was always funny because there was like, Litecoin announces that they're going to implement MimbleWimble in some time, and then their price like jumps, and we're like, wait a second, but we already implemented it at like our price is like flat. So yeah, there was attention. I don't think it directly influenced Beam performance, let's say financial performance in major way. But yeah, now so like MimbleWimble, obviously it was all the buzz back in 2019. Since then, I think it's been like less, I would say prominent in many discussions,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Despite the fact that, and I still personally love this protocol because of its unbelievable extensibility and things that we were able to do with it. If we ever discover, who invented it, I will really thank this person because I think he was a genius. Like today, I think most of there are two parts to this question. Like what's the protocol? Like there was, a long debate, which is more private, this protocol, that protocol.
Yeah.
So eventually it's a question of the anonymity set or the effective anonymity set, right? And as long as your effective anonymity set is good enough or big enough, you can work with, you can work with Monero, you can work with any confidential by default cryptocurrency today and be sufficiently private for most purposes. And I think today is the question of being used in real world use cases, right? So like what can you offer outside of direct exchange of value? This is at least where we are trying to go, right? This is the market that we are trying to address. Because I don't see Beam competing like with Monero on volume or community. That's like very difficult to achieve, and definitely not in the bear market where the overall attention is relatively low. But I think that if Beam manages to become this kind of financial transaction layer for several different types of decentralized applications, this will increase our adoption and eventually allow us to develop in this direction.
Yeah, that's for sure. I think a lot of people built Bitcoin first because it was, unique and seen as something very valuable for the world. And of course, the market has since kind of confirmed that. And then people kind of had this base assumption of, well, that's valuable. We'll just create better ways of transacting, and that will be equally or more valuable. And then the market response has not been very good. I mean, I think I would say Bitcoin is the only cryptocurrency that generates anything reasonable as far as fee revenue for simple sending and receiving of financial transactions with nothing else really on top. And then like Litecoin and Monero, like Litecoin is doing pretty well as far as volumes, as far as, a couple 100,000 transactions a day. Monero's, significantly less than that, but it's still, both of those generate under $1,000 of fee to revenue per day for the entirety of the network. And so, on the other hand, not only is Ethereum making a ton of money, but a lot of the Ethereum L2s or competitors or things like that, they're nowhere near that level, still generate something. They still put like 20, 30, 40, $50,000 a day or something. They're still making something happen. They're still a business model, right? And so it does kind of make sense that trying to compete in the payments only space without anything extra like, well, private payments, and even then it's very difficult. But like things like that, it seems to be very tough, kind of tough thing to do. People want to do more things than that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm really kind of one of the concerns I would say that I have in general about many crypto projects these days, but also specifically about Ethereum, is kind of a little bit giving up on decentralization a little bit.
Of course.
You know, in the discourse, in the attention, and it's a pity because I think that decentralization is one of the core principles and core things that crypto has to offer. Yeah, so every time I encounter yet another pseudo decentralized or completely decentralized project, I'm like a little bit sad. But yeah,
Yeah.
I agree.
The VC push has been real, and it's the decentralization is kind of one of those things like privacy where it absolutely does not matter in the slightest until it matters more than anything. Where
Yes.
you can use it anything that's very centralized. Like let's just pick on Solana because everyone does. You can just use Solana, no problem. You can do the same things you can on something like Ethereum, except probably cheaper. And so the extra you might be paying for decentralization is wasted money almost. But then if the whole thing goes down or starts getting censored, then all of a sudden everything matters. And it's the same thing with privacy. I still know there's quite a few EOS-based blockchains out there, and or EOS or Steam-based or whatever, and those are very interesting in that they tend to have a human-readable username for addresses a lot of times, but then also as an account-based model with no privacy, it's probably like the worst privacy you could imagine in crypto because of you just have a username that can be very easily identified with the person unless you randomize it on purpose, but then you just see everything they've ever done, every smart contract operation, every transfer, everything is just so easy to see, which makes them as great teaching tools for like blockchain beginners about like, look, this is how it works, but horrible for if you'd imagine. But the fact that they're still around and being used to this extent shows that this hasn't, like, there have been no consequences largely.
So one of the interesting properties of blockchains is that like the longevity of the projects. So let me give you like a couple of examples. Like Green and Beam both exist for almost the same period of time. Different levels of development, different levels of changes, like new features, like completely two kind of if you look at the things that have been happening in the two protocols, they're different. Both blockchains alive have almost the same market cap, right? So it's a good thing, and it's also in some ways, I don't know, maybe not so good thing, but blockchains live for long periods of time, including, as you said, blockchains that are not necessarily used anymore or provide too much value. They just continue living. The good thing is that like you can still have a community, you can still build. There is always interest. It's always working. So if it was a regular startup, it might have been running out of money and closing, right? But since it's a living organism, it's community driven, it's supported by developers. So these projects live for long periods of time, for good or for bad. It happens. Also, there is a lot of change. Like for example, specifically you mentioned Solana. They're now kind of getting out from under this cloud of all of this FTX disaster, and they are kind of trying to restart their ecosystem, trying to build new things. So like, despite the fact that yes, they have a ton of issues with centralization and stability and everything like that, they are very much alive. They're spending funds. They're kind of doing so. It's an interesting world out there for sure.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, this has been quite the enlightening chat. Where do you want to direct people to follow you and Beam and all that kind of stuff?
Okay, so we have communities on Telegram, right? So just look for Beam Privacy on Telegram. Follow us on Twitter at Beam Privacy. Follow me at Beam CTO on Twitter, and we do have a regular kind of weekly Twitter space. If you want to come and ask questions and hear us, discuss the recent developments every Thursday, so you can subscribe to that, and obviously visit the website beam.mw. Download the wallet, play with it. We have a lot of if you heard about the project several years ago, you will be pleasantly surprised, I think, with the new things that we have done.
Fantastic. Well, thanks very much for chatting.
Thanks. It's been great. Thank you very much for having me.